Welcome back to the series, Mistakes to Avoid If You Want to Be Successful in Business Overseas. Or, more appropriately, mistakes to avoid because you want to be successful overseas. Isn't that right? Today, we will discuss another mistake to avoid. So let's recap scenario number 3 from our previous session. Remember Andrew, who was conducting business in the Middle East, and he gave the thumbs up hand gesture in the midst of a negotiation. Well, the host ended the meeting abruptly, although many agenda topics had not yet been covered. As in our previous sessions, Andrew sensed that something had gone wrong, but he had no idea what had happened or that he had broken an invisible rule. So do you know what his mistake was? Remember, he didn't even say anything. Okay, even though he did not use words, he communicated non-verbally. He offended his host with an obscene hand gesture. Yes, he used the thumbs up hand gesture. One of the greatest sources of confusion when trying to understand the hundreds of hand gestures that are used in different cultures is that different cultures can use different gestures to signify the same thing. Or different cultures can use the same gesture, but they can carry different meanings. As a result, certain hand gestures can cause confusion or even embarrassment when they convey unintended messages and sometimes even the opposite message of what was intended. A harmless or friendly gesture in one culture may be understood as threatening or antagonistic or even offensive in another. So what do we know about hand gestures? Well, there are hundreds of them all over the world used to convey a variety of messages from approval to confidence to confusion to frustration to boredom to suspicion, distrust, or even lust. So, what we know about hand gestures is that they're done unconsciously. We also know that they're not formally taught, nor are other elements of body language taught, and there are no dictionaries to really find out what's going on formally. We also know that gestures can evoke strong emotions when inappropriate, and they can certainly cause a lot of embarrassment. So we're going to talk about the kinds of gestures that are most problematic. There are 5 different kinds of hand gestures, but we're only going to talk about emblems today. And what are emblems? Those are nonverbal messages that have a direct verbal counterpart. And what do we mean by that? The gesture itself is a substitute for the words. So when you're using an emblem, the person listening to you does not have the benefit of the verbal message that goes along with the symbol or the emblem or gesture. So how do we know which gestures carry which meanings? Well, some are fairly universal. We shake our fists in anger. That's universally understood. We clap our hands when we're approving. That's pretty universally understood. When we're bored, we yawn, and if we'd like to get attention in a crowd, we raise our hand. Yes, that's appropriate, and it's generally understood everywhere in the world. Now, there are other gestures that are common outside the U.S., but generally we're not familiar with them. For example, if you were in a meeting in Great Britain and someone were doing this, tapping their nose, what you may not know is that they're alerting you to the fact that this message is confidential. There's secrecy around what they're conveying to you. If you're in Italy and a person does this, they're probably warning you to be on the alert. Maybe they're saying, I know this guy, don't trust a word he says. Or if you're in Holland or Australia and someone does the nose tap on the front of the nose, they're probably suggesting that you should mind your own business. It would be good to know that, right? Now let's talk about those gestures or emblems for which there are wide variations in meaning. Most of these are very, very common all over the world, the gestures themselves. However, the meanings vary, so it's important for us to be aware of them. The first one is the thumbs up hand gesture. As you can see, I'm not using the gesture. Although it conveys approval here in the United States, it is considered to be obscene in many parts of the world, so I generally avoid it altogether. And I certainly, if I decided I wanted to go hitchhiking in places like Spain or Greece or parts of Belgium or Malta, I would not hitchhike using this gesture. I'd ask the locals what was appropriate. Another very common gesture that's used throughout the world is the ring symbol or circle with thumb and forefinger, or what we call it here in the United States is the A-OK gesture. Now, if you were invited to dinner at the home of a friend, he had prepared a meal for you, and he asked you at the end, so how did you like the meal? If you're here in the United States or in Canada, you use that A-OK gesture, and he knows that you thought the meal was splendid. You really liked it, and you'd recommend it to others. If you were in France and you used that gesture, you'd be signaling that the meal was a big fat zero, and you thought he was worthless as a chef. If you were in Japan and you used that gesture, you'd be conveying money or some form of currency, so the message would be rather confusing, possibly inappropriate, because it would be insulting. If you were in Malta and you used that signal, you'd be letting your friend know that you think he's gay, which, you know, if he is gay, that's probably okay, but if he's not, he may have a problem with that. And finally, if you're in Greece, avoid that gesture altogether, because for centuries that gesture has conveyed a private body part. So we don't want to do that, right? We won't go there. Now let me tell you about a final story, a famous story in fact, of a misinterpretation of a hand gesture. Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier during the height of the Cold War in Russia, had visited the United States. And just as he was exiting his taxi, he was surrounded by members of the press, and he used a gesture. This is the photo. Can you see it? That was spread across the headlines of all the newspapers here in the U.S. And this clasped set of hands over the head at the time conveyed to a lot of Americans who were big fans of boxing, the sport of boxing, it conveyed that, yes, I was victorious over my opponent. And so Americans interpreted Khrushchev's gesture to mean that the Soviet Union is victorious over the U.S. in the Cold War. Not a good thing. Well, in fact, Khrushchev's gesture was indicating that he believed that the U.S. and the Russia should be friends. Yes, this was the symbol of international friendship for Russia. And there have been many instances since that time where Russians were using that gesture with Americans and Americans were offended. So what's my advice for you if you plan to do business overseas, because I know you want to be successful? Well, number one, do your homework. Be aware of differences by researching communication basics, find out the main body language pitfalls to avoid, and learn what's taboo in that culture. Number two, my rule of thumb is that you should avoid substituting gestures for words. Just don't use them. Use the words instead. And secondly, don't presume that you can accurately interpret their gestures. And number three, if you perceive something went wrong, try to rectify it on the spot by admitting you may have offended, but you did not intend to. If you'd like more information, visit us at globalwaysusa.com. Have a good trip.